Thank you for choosing American Pest CEUs.
Hi, I'm Sean Reeves with American Pest CEUs. I've been in the pest management industry since 1999. I'm an associate certified entomologist, and I'll be your instructor for today's course. Today's course was compiled by Jack Launius, who has served in the pest management industry since 1990.
Today's course is titled Exclusion and Deterrents for Smaller Animals. Introduction. Exclusion refers to the use of barriers to reduce access of wildlife to resources. It is a type of habitat modification. Wildlife enters structures through existing holes or cracks in walls and foundations, or by gnawing new holes. Chimneys and vents offer access opportunities as well. This course gives you information on exclusion and deterrence, both valuable methods to prevent and control wildlife damage. Exclusion as prevention. Exclusion does not use chemicals that may harm non-target animals or people. Second, exclusion provides immediate, relief, and frequently 100% protection. A disadvantage of exclusion is the time required. It may take several days to complete a single job, particularly when large areas need protection. And I can attest to everyone here that exclusion can be a really big job. As we go throughout this course, we're going to talk more about that, but just keep in mind it's a labor-intensive, painstaking job, especially on commercial properties. But to be honest with you, even on residential homes, you can have some major exclusion work. It's not that uncommon for you to need to do $5,000, $8,000, or $10,000 worth of work depending on the severity of the issue. I want you to keep in mind as we go through this course how valuable these types of services are and how important they can be as you grow your pest control career. Protecting structures. Knowledge of how to exclude rodents from structures provides a foundation for understanding how to use this technique on other animals. As valuable as exclusion techniques are, property owners should be made aware that excluding rodents from a structure will not guarantee rodent-free buildings forever. Rodents can gain access to a structure by gnawing a new hole or getting carried in with a box or appliance or moving in from an open door. Therefore, exclusion techniques should be part of an overall integrated pest management (IPM) program that includes sanitation, population control, and monitoring. I can't impress this fact upon you guys enough that when you do a rodent exclusion, it is very, very important to let the people know that doesn't mean there won't be rodents in the building ever again. As we mentioned here, that means we've stopped what's coming in now, we've shut down the areas, but at any given time they can chew back into a structure. Also, different weather conditions, wind, hurricanes, tornadoes, a lot of things can happen to that structure that could open areas up again. It can be a major point of contention with you and your customer when they have an issue in the future that's outside of your control, and you explain to them there's going to be more work, potentially more cost for them. Most people are not happy about that. They're like, no, I paid a lot of money for this exclusion work. I shouldn't have any problems. So make sure you set the expectations correctly so you don't find yourself in that situation in the future. We also need to make sure we know the animals. Effective exclusion requires awareness of an animal's behavior and physical capabilities. Generally, an entire structure must be secured to prevent access by climbing animals, but only 48 inches to prevent access by those that cannot climb well. Exclusion of birds requires consideration of the entire building, especially perching and nesting locations. And I know this sounds pretty simple when I say know the animals, but you have to think about it. If you don't know the animals, their habits, their physical capabilities, their behaviors, you're not going to know where to look for entry points, but also you're not going to be able to figure out how to exclude the building correctly to stop them in the future. So keep in mind, a big part of what we need to do before any exclusion work is done, do your homework, understand the different animals and their capabilities. Then once you do the inspection and figure out what exclusion work needs to be done, it's a lot more likely you're going to stop the problem and have it be more of a once and done then continuing to go out for the same problems on the same structures again, which ultimately hurts your credibility, frustrates yourself, and frustrates your customers as well. Holes and openings. A thorough site inspection is necessary for any exclusion technique to be effective. All potential entry points must be located. Rats need slightly more than a half-inch gap to enter. Mice need slightly more than a quarter-inch gap. Do not ignore small crevices, as gnawing rodents can enlarge them quickly. In the current image, you're seeing where a rodent has chewed through a door going into a garage. So this was like the side walk-in door, and the rodents chewed right through the trim. Of course, it's a wood trim, so that was pretty easy for them, but this is the point we're making. If there's wood or there's an area especially that's a little soft or weak or a little hole already started, because rodents are always chewing and looking for entry points, a small hole can become a much bigger issue. Next, consider whether a potential opening may be filled or if it must be screened or metal put in place. If airflow is needed, use the proper screen material. If the gap can be filled, several options are available. And one point I want to make on this is you do not want to be the technician that causes a ventilation issue. You don't ever want to seal up an area that's used for ventilation, so just make sure you understand which type of technique you're going to use. If it's an area where you need to keep ventilation, something like hardware cloth can work great. Whereas if you have an opening like you see on the left side of the screen here, you can use a material like an aluminum flashing, because at that point we're going to seal the area up and we don't have to worry about any ventilation issues. So at that point, why not just seal it up with something solid and be done with it? Let's talk about exclusion products. You're going to secure holes up to 1/2 inch in diameter with caulk or other sealant. Sealants have greater elasticity than caulks and are preferable where movement in the substrate is expected, such as joints. Gaps larger than 1/2 inch require a backer to help hold the sealant. Backer rod, copper stuffet, and excluder have the flexibility to be wedged in crevices. They also provide enough structure to support the sealant as it dries. On the current image, you're seeing products that are actually used in rodent. On the current image, you're seeing some common products used in exclusion techniques. If we look at the products above, top to bottom, left to right, 1, we've got stuffet, copper mesh, 2, aluminum roll, 3, foam backer rod, 4, hardware cloth, 5, excluder, and 6, galvanized plate. These are some common materials that you're going to want to know about when you get to doing exclusion work. Caulks and sealants come in several formulations. When selecting a caulk or sealant, choose the one that is appropriate for the substrate, exposure to weather, and aesthetics. So those of you that have been doing exclusion for a while, you totally understand we got to look at the substrate, we got to look at what we're working on, right? So it doesn't matter where it's at. It could be on a roof, it could be like a soffit area, it could be an area where there's wood siding, whatever the case may be. We got to look at the different substrates and figure out what types of foams, what types of caulks or sealants are going to work. And then exposure to weather. Is this something that's going to be right out in the sunshine? Is the UV rays going to be an issue breaking it down? Also aesthetics. Now I could talk all day about aesthetics and exclusion work. At the end of the day, you really have to be smart when it comes to aesthetics. A lot of homes we work on are higher end homes where people really put value in their curb appeal. If you make a mistake and you use the wrong caulks or foams or something like that, and you mess up their home and that curb appeal's lost, I can tell you you're going to have major issues with the homeowner. I can't tell you how many times through the years I've come back after somebody's done rodent exclusion work that didn't look good and had to fix it because the homeowners, they will not accept the front of their home looking bad. Now there are some older structures where you might get away with a little more, but really think about it. If you're going to be a quality exclusion technician, you need to make that work look good, because it's not just solving the problem. We also have to make it look good aesthetically if we want our customers to be happy. Fill large openings, such as holes made by squirrels or raccoons. First, with expanding foam to prevent leakage of air. It is thought that by inhibiting air movement and potential heat loss, animals will be less attracted to the structure as a possible nest or den site. After sealing the holes, install a gnaw-resistant barrier over the gap to prevent entry. Let's look at the differences in caulking. Looking at the differences in caulking, we're going to have oil-based caulking, which is low cost, easy to use, adheres well to most non-porous surfaces. We have butyl rubber-based caulking, non-hardening, adhere well to masonry and concrete, good water resistance, and then we're going to have latex caulking, which is low cost, easy to use, and readily adhere to most surfaces. Causes steel to rust, can be applied to wet surfaces, but not appropriate for permanently wet locations. Acrylic latex caulking. Similar to latex caulks, but are more suitable for outdoors and are more resistant to UV light. Siliconized acrylic latex. A flexible material that can be used on joints in wood, metals, glass, and tile up to 1/2 inch wide. It is highly resistant to weathering and can last 20 to 30 years outdoors. Ethylene copolymer. Works on most materials, but not all plastic. It has many of the same properties as siliconized acrylic latex, but it breaks down much more quickly due to its sensitivity to UV light. Polysulfide. Difficult to apply, may require the mixing of two products, may require primers, therefore their use is very limited. Urethanes. Like polysulfide, however they have better adhesion to most surfaces. Silicone. Some silicone products are not compatible with concrete. They have otherwise good adhesion to most surfaces. They have the widest range in surface temperatures, -65 to -130 degrees. So everyone, when it comes to caulk sealants and adhesives, there's just so many choices out there, it can be really tough. As you can see in the images I'm going to be showing, there's a lot of different ones that you can buy at pretty much any store. I can buy these at a local hardware store, Home Depot, Lowe's, even Walmart, or even Amazon these days. I mean, everybody's buying stuff everywhere. The reality is that you really have to understand what type of caulk, sealant, or adhesive is going to be applicable for the area you're working on. To just make sure, just like you do with pesticides, that you read the labels, you understand what type of product you're using, you understand what it's made for, and you'll have a lot better success if you make sure that you're using the right type of caulk, sealants, and adhesives. If you don't, you're just going to be going back and you're going to have future problems. There's no point in putting a band-aid on something, because what happens is, whether it's weeks or months down the line, it comes back to bite you and you're out there doing the same work over again. Let's talk about recommended materials for rodent proofing. You know guys, when it comes to rodent proofing, everybody's got materials they like to use. Or those of you that are just starting may not know yet, but in reality, as you grow in your career, you're going to learn what materials you like the best. Now in this slide, we're going to talk about some of those materials. We're going to look at concrete, which when you use it reinforced, it's going to need a minimum thickness of 2 inches. If it's not reinforced, you're going to need 3¼ inches. So keep in mind what we're saying there. We have to make sure that rodents or wildlife, whatever the case may be we're trying to exclude, can't push their way through. You have to keep in mind, they're going to try to get back in the same areas. They're going to be following pheromone scents, urine scents. Sometimes we seal up an area, there may be babies trapped inside. Imagine what the mother's going to do then. They're going to do anything they can to get back in. So that's why we either need reinforced concrete of the 2 inches, or not reinforced has to be 3¼ inches. Next, we're going to look at galvanized sheet metal, which needs to be 24 gauge or heavier. Now, if you're using perforated sheet metal, grills, they're going to need to be 14 gauge. So keep in mind the same issues. You don't want these rodents and wildlife to push their way back through. We can use bricks. They're going to need to be 3¾ inches thick with mortar-filled joints or stainless steel vents. Finally, on this slide, we're going to look at hardware cloth, which is wire mesh, 19 gauge, 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch mesh to exclude rats, hardware cloth 24 gauge, 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch mesh to exclude mice. For openings less than 3/4 inches in diameter that cannot be secured by other means, wedge copper mesh tightly into the gap. And just to be honest with everybody here, I would say hardware cloth is the most used rodent exclusion material in the industry. Now that 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch mesh, I don't like to work with as much. I think it's really hard to work with. It's really sharp. It can cut you really easy. It's harder to bend. I really like that 24 gauge 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch because then I know it's going to exclude mice and rats anyways. Most of the time we want to make sure that we're excluding both. So keep in mind you need to figure out what works for you. I just find the 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch a lot easier to work with, a lot easier to shape, and from a safety standpoint, a lot less likely you're going to get a puncture through your skin. Obviously you always want to wear gloves when you're doing something like this anyway. Now for openings less than 3/4 inches in diameter as we're talking about, they can be secured by those other means, so you can just like stuff copper mesh in the gaps. I would just say one word of warning with that is, make sure the copper mesh is glued in there, make sure there's some type of adhesive. Just stuffing it in there and thinking that a rodent or animal's not going to pull it out, it's not going to work. I'm going to tell you up front, I've seen so many times where technicians would go out, they'd put copper mesh up in something, they'd stuff it in with their finger or pencil, whatever they use, screwdriver. Next thing you know, a mouse or a rat's just pulled that right back out. So just keep in mind you can use these types of things like the stuff at copper mesh, but you got to make sure it's secured into the gaps. When we talk about any type of exclusion, we have to talk about some things that are temporary and unprofessional. Here's two of those things. Coarse steel wool will work temporarily, but eventually will rust. Never rely on expanding foam alone to secure an opening. If it's exposed to the sun, it will eventually break down, and any pest that can chew wood will chew right through it. Many of you would understand when we're dealing with things like steel wool or these rolls of steel, they're going to rust over a period of time. As we mentioned, they will work temporarily. The problem is through oxidization, through rain, humidity, all the moisture, they're going to start to rust. They're really not going to be a good long-term solution. Now, looking at what we're showing here, if you're trying to deal with expanding foam alone, you're going to have another major issue. Now, a lot of times people will use hardware cloth, stuff it up in an area, maybe in a V shape, and then they'll try to foam it in. And that's much better, but we just have to keep in mind, anytime foam is exposed to the sun, it's going to break down. So maybe you do have a good enough backing in the back with hardware cloth or something like that, which is great. But in my mind, I think there's better ways of doing it. So you'll see a lot of different techniques out there. I much more prefer different types of things that won't cause the issues that we're talking about here. Chimneys. Every flue in a masonry chimney should be protected with a professionally manufactured chimney cap that meets all requirements in your local fire code. Chimney caps are sold in single flue and multi-flue designs. Purchase and install only professionally manufactured chimney caps made with stainless steel or copper. Galvanized steel caps do not provide sufficient savings to justify their use. Chimney caps have solid roofs that protect the chimney crown from water damage. Check existing chimney caps for damage. Ensure that animals are not residing in flues prior to capping. So there is a couple things I want to reiterate in this slide. Number one, always make sure you know and understand local fire code. We don't ever want to do anything that's against the code. And also, of course, we don't want to put families at risk or harm. Not that the fire inspector is going to come out and look and see if something's up to code. That typically isn't going to happen. But we always have to think about safety for ourselves and the people we serve. Now also you have to think about this from a liability standpoint. If you do something out of code and it does cause a fire, you can only imagine what that's going to do for your company. So keep in mind, for all the reasons we've stated, we definitely have to make sure we watch out for fire codes when we're dealing with chimneys. Two other things just real quickly on here. We definitely want to use stainless steel or copper for all chimney caps. We talked about this before. Anything that's galvanized or steel, it's going to be an issue long term. Galvanized is better than just plain steel, but it's all going to rust at some point. I'm telling you, I've seen it throughout my career time and time again. Also, we need to make sure there's not animals residing in flues prior to capping. Nothing's worse than you sealing that chimney cap off and having an animal down in the flue. That animal's at some point going to come down into the house. It's going to cause damage. Even if it doesn't cause damage, it's probably going to be like that Chevy Chase Christmas movie where there's a squirrel running through the house and everybody's screaming, yelling, and God only knows what happens after that. So just keep in mind, you have to make sure those flues are clear. Do a good inspection, shine a light down the chimney, look up at the flue from underneath. Make sure there's not an animal trapped in there. Under no circumstances should galvanized hardware cloth be used to protect a chimney opening. Wire mesh eventually rusts, and the screen may allow water from snow, rain, or exhaust fumes to freeze, thereby blocking the exhaust gases and forcing them into the home. Consult state regulators before modifying vents. Vents require special care because they must allow airflow. Screen with a mesh size less than 1/2 by 1/2 inch may significantly reduce airflow. Roof and attic vents. Professionally manufactured screens come in both stainless steel and galvanized metal. Stainless steel screens are preferable for roof vents. Follow manufacturer recommendations for securing the screen to a roof to prevent leaking and ice damming. Check state regulations before securing vents. Although screens installed from inside an attic are effective and often easier to install, avoid using this option when protecting dome vents and other large areas. While your screen will prevent entry into the attic, birds and squirrels may build a nest on top of the screen under the protection of a dome vent. Another important note here, if there are large mature trees close enough that they're leaning over the structure, we need to trim those back. When I say we, this may be a partnership with your client. It may be a service you offer as well if you're an exclusion or pest control company, but just keep in mind these need to be trimmed back. We don't want to leave this easy access for rodents and animals to just get up on a tree and hop right on the roof. It's something that we need to take care of, and it's something that's really important when we think about integrated pest management and how we can modify the habitat to limit access for rodents and animals to the roof lines of homes and other structures. Ideally, screens should have a mesh size of 1/4 inch to prevent entry by bats and mice, although the size should be balanced with airflow considerations. When installing vents, particularly on a roof, it is critical to seal screws to prevent leaks. Place a bead of roof sealant under and on top of the shingle where the screw is to be placed. After driving the screw through the sealant, cap the screw with a final dab of sealant. Consider whether snow or ice may be blocked by the screen. You may need to install barriers, cricket, to shift snow and ice to one or both sides of the screen. Weep vents are gaps that are purposely placed in brick walls to allow moisture to vent outward. With brick veneer construction, a gap often is placed behind the brick where drywall does not come completely down to the bottom edge. Small animals can move freely behind the brick and find entry into the home through the gaps. And I consider this a great example of an overlooked area when we're looking at exclusions, so just look out for these. They'll be every 2 or 3 bricks on a brick foundation, but look for these gaps because you're going to need to seal them up. I can't tell you how many exclusion companies miss this, and then you're going to have a plan in place because obviously it can be pretty tedious work. But just keep in mind, if you don't seal up these weep vents, you're going to have a problem in the future. It's going to be that one area you didn't seal up that leads to the issue you can't solve. The holes, especially if they encompass an entire mortar joint, usually about 3/8 inch wide, can permit insects, mice, even small snakes to enter and take up residence in these areas, finding the air gaps behind the walls and eventually finding their way into the residence, maybe along baseboards, anywhere along those walls where they can find a little gap, they'll work their way into the residence. So that's why it's really important again to seal up these weep hole areas. Ridge vents frequently are missing end covers that provide openings for wildlife. Use copper stuffit or excluder and sealant to secure the ends. Add hardware cloth to the spot to increase its resistance to animal entry. So in this image, we're showing a common ridge vent opening, and then a solution looking at a product made by our friends at AAC Distributing. You can see this product has a nice finish. It seals off the area, and you can tell by looking at it, it's painted with a coating to make sure it's never going to rust. So for many, many years to come, this should provide a great solution to this area. When we look at other vents, we need to think about dryer exhaust vents. They're going to require special consideration, as improper screening hastens the buildup of lint and increases the likelihood of fires. Although some screens have air-activated flaps that seal when not in use, the flaps often fail as they become jammed with lint. Personally, I recommend avoiding plastic dryer vent covers. They break easily, and they are certainly not varmint-proof. So as you can see in the images here, these plastic vent covers often fall apart. The ones with the 3 flaps, commonly I see the flaps falling off. And plastic is something that rodents and animals can chew through pretty easily. Also, birds will try to peck and rip away at these. So there's really no point in using these plastic covers. They're just going to lead to more problems at work in the future. Sewer vents may attract squirrels that occasionally enter vents, thus raising the possibility of blockage. Crown vent guards are designed to prevent animal entry. Ensure that exhaust pipes meet Consumer Product Safety Commission standards. Properly seal gaps between pipes and structures to prevent rodent entry. And as you can see here, this is a really nice way to seal off a vent pipe. You've got your different colors, and it's just going to look really aesthetically pleasing. You may have noticed we showed you this earlier in the course, but I can just tell you my experience with these has been great. Now there is a higher cost to them, so you have to justify it to homeowners and business owners. But at the end of the day, when you look at it, you can tell this is good, solid exclusion work. Other vents on a wall may be secured with galvanized 1/4 to 1/2 inch wire mesh. Cut the mesh at least 1 inch wider than the size of the vent to provide space to secure the screen to the surface. For triangular vents, measure the base and height of the triangle, add 1 inch to each measurement, and cut a rectangle or square. Use wire blade pliers to fold back all of the edges 3/4 of an inch all the way around. Secure a screen in several places with screws to prevent animals from pulling it off the structure. Screws with washers or expanded heads prevent the screen from popping over the screws. Use staples to secure the screen between the screwed areas. So basically at this point, once we've got it down, we want to make sure that screen stays down. So that's why we're saying make sure you use screws with the washer style heads like you see here. If you use just a screw, that head's too small, eventually something may be able to pull it up. And also you can use the staples in between the screwed areas to keep it screwed down, just to make sure it's Loctite and it stays down. Once again, remember, animals are always going to be trying to work their way back into these areas. Cover window wells 4 inches deep or more to prevent wildlife entrapment. Window well covers are easy to install and effective. There are several styles depending on the well shroud. If the cover will be or could be walked on, use a metal grate under the cover. The current slide has given you a few ideas of what exclusion work can look like on window wells. Take a couple moments to review these images. Crack and gap sealers, such as foam, provide a convenient way to fill cracks, crevices, and voids. Although rodents can gnaw through foam, its insulating properties play an important role in assisting more permanent exclusion methods. Foam degrades when exposed to sunlight unless it's painted or covered. So there is some good insulating properties with foam as we're talking about here. I don't like the finish that well myself. I really don't like to use foam and paint it, or even the pure black foam. Like, I've used it, I put the hardware cloth in. There are times when it can be a good thing, but but I really prefer to use some sort of an aluminum flashing in front of that foam. So you put the foam in, then put the flashing over it. At that point you can paint the flashing, which you can get it in silver, unfinished, white or black anyways, but I really like something like that where you get a better finish on the outside. Just really believe it's going to look a lot better. Plus it's going to protect that foam from degrading from things like sunlight. Caulk and sealants cost more than foams, but provide a more durable seal for cracks and crevices. The products are sold in a variety of formulations and colors. Have several available for the most common applications in your area. Caulk should only be used for openings 1/2 inch or less in size. Larger openings need filler, such as a hardware cloth or a professional sealant, or should be secured by another means. Copper stuffed consists of woven copper mesh that is durable and highly flexible. It can be inserted around pipes and into small crevices with a flathead screwdriver or putty knife. Cut the fabric to the desired length with tin snips or heavy-duty scissors. Be aware that rodents can gnaw through this material. So there are some things I like about this material. It's durable, it's not going to rust or anything like that. You always have to remember to glue it into place with a caulk or a foam, as we talked about earlier. But the other problem is that eventually rodents can chew through this material. So to me, unless it's a smaller hole type of area, it's not something I'm going to use on a big area. I don't want to deal with a spot where rodents have chewed back through and I'm having to go back and redo work that was already done. Excluder fill fabric consists of nylon fabric impregnated with strands of stainless steel wire. Wear gloves when handling it to prevent injury. This material is flexible, but not as flexible as copper stuffed. The impregnated stainless steel fibers may provide greater resistance to gnawing by rodents. Again, this is like the stuffed copper mesh in a way, but that greater resistance to gnawing by rodents is very important. A lot of people use this in areas like door trims and at the bottom of garage door seals because it has been highly effective in my experience of sealing rodents out of these areas. Exterior doors, including pedestrian walk-in and garage doors. Doors should fit tightly enough, so if you place a dollar bill on the bottom of the door threshold, you close the door and pull on the dollar bill, there is resistance when pulling on the dollar bill. The bottom of the door is as tight as it should be at that. If you see daylight, the door needs some work. This may include vertical weather stripping, door sweeps, and or thresholds. There are several varieties of door thresholds and sweeps and weather stripping available. Mechanical door closing devices reduce the likelihood of a door getting left open. Doors that are left open for ventilation should have rodent-proof screen doors added. And this is something you might see in an area like a restaurant. You notice if you go back behind a restaurant building, a lot of times there's a door leading to the outside and it gets really hot in the kitchens and they're trying to get some ventilation in there. So they'll have those rodent-proof screen doors on there. If they don't and they've got something more standard where rodents can work their way in, again, they're going to end up having a problem. So you just have to make sure if somebody's leaving a door open for ventilation, it does need a rodent-proof screen door. Foundations. Gaps or flaws often exist along building exteriors where the wall framing or siding meets the foundation of the sill plate. These gaps provide easy access for rodents. Rats can burrow beneath the floor or foundation of a building that rests on piers or shallow foundation walls. Prevent their entry by extending foundation walls or curtain wall at least 36 inches below ground. This can be a really tough scenario. It's not something that has an easy answer. I would definitely say this. Ideally, you would extend 36 inches below ground. That's not always going to be something you can do. Obviously, a structure has been there in place for years, usually when you get there. So you're not going to dig out a new foundation wall or something like that. In these scenarios, typically, you would bury hardware cloth underground. I'm not going to tell you the exact depth. I think 36 inches is a lot, but I've also seen rats dig down and come up from a pretty good ways down. So I don't know, maybe something like a 24-inch step, something like that. Ideally 36, but again, that would probably be too much work. But just understand that these rodents are going to burrow, they can get their way underground, and they can come up right underneath that foundation. Maintain a clean 3-foot wide, weed-free area around building foundations, concrete slabs, and footings to discourage rodents from burrowing. This makes it easier to see holes, burrows, or other wildlife signs as well. Maintain the buffer by mowing vegetation regularly or applying 1 1/2 inches of crushed rock to a depth of 3 inches along a 24-inch wide strip or wider around the structure. So again, look at this. As you can see in the photo, we've got a nice area here to do an inspection. And even if something does try to dig down through there, even with those 3 inches of rocks, first of all, it's not going to be easy. But second of all, we're going to be able to see it real quickly and resolve the issue. A sheet metal or aluminum guard at the inside corners of walls prevents rodents and other animals from climbing. Protecting decks, sheds, and foundation crawl spaces. Structures that lack full foundations, e.g., trailers, sheds, and decks, are vulnerable to entry by skunks, woodchucks, raccoons, and other burrowing animals. Crushed gravel is not sufficient for these situations. Instead, use shallow trench screen to prevent animal access. What we're talking about here is the fact that you do want to bury the hardware cloth about 12 inches or more out from the foundation. So as you can imagine, a rodent, an animal's going to try to come up by the foundation. They're going to try to dig downward, but that barrier is going to stop them from being able to come in underneath that foundation, that deck, whatever the case may be. They're going to dig down, they're going to hit the hardware cloth, and that's going to be the end of the journey for them. Increase the depth and skirting of the screen in locations subject to frost heaves or with wildlife that have a tendency to dig aggressively. Use 1/2-inch mesh if more airflow is needed. Pay special attention to corners to ensure that they are properly protected. Overlap screens 4 to 6 inches to prevent gaps that could be exploited by digging animals. As I previously mentioned, I do like the 1/4-inch by 1/4-inch screen just because it seems to be safer and easier to work with. But when you need more airflow, you're going to need to use this 1/2-inch screen. I can tell you this is very solid as well. So outside of the fact that it is a little tougher to work with, it is something that's very solid and it is going to give you that extra airflow. Let's talk about solar powered or hot wired motion detection LED lights. Most animals will move away from areas that have bright lights come on as they approach. When you purchase LED lights, it will normally state on the box the area of coverage. You should make sure the coverage area slightly overlaps. The lights can be purchased as surface or wall mount or stake mount at ground level. I personally prefer wall mount. It's harder for lawn keepers to hit them with a weed whacker. Keep in mind, solar powered lights won't charge in shaded areas. I say that because you can't fix stupid. And when I say that, I'm probably speaking for myself more than anybody, because I've made every mistake you can make out there. So sometimes I put simple things in here because it really brings home the point that we have to be aware of what we're doing, why we're doing it, because if we make one mistake, it can throw our whole job off. On this slide, you're seeing some common examples of solar powered lights. Again, this is a newer technology. I've found that they work fairly well. Some are brighter than others. I really think you need to know what type of lumens they're going to put out. But as long as they're high enough lumens to illuminate the area, then these can be very effective. My neighbor came to my door just before sundown one evening, asking if I could come and see what I thought was wrong with the new lights he had put up. I said sure, and walked down with him. On the way, he was explaining that he bought 6 solar-powered lights from a big box store that offered installation. When we got to the house, I walked around once and asked him how he was getting sunlight under his eaves and around the trees hanging over the roof. I left him as he stood there with his mouth wide open. You can't fix stupid. Special situations. Some products are designed to address specific problems. Many homes with vinyl siding allow rodent access at the bottom corners of the structure. On the current image, you're seeing some ideas for solutions for this issue. Now you can see, obviously, we've got an open like J-channel where the siding's going in at the corner of the house. So we definitely have to fill that area up and make sure that the rodents don't have access. Probably the best solution I've seen for sealing up these areas is a product called Critter Cap. It's made by AAC Distributing. It's not that I'm plugging them, but I'm always looking for the best solutions and best products out there. And as you can see on the screen here, the corners on this home where the siding comes together on the channel are wide open. We can even see a wasp nest up under this one. The simple solution is using something like the Critter Cap to just seal this area up. I'm saying this because so many people like to use things like foam or try to do an area like this with hardware cloth. I've even seen people try to do concrete, caulk. At the end of the day, you really need something that's going to fit in and close that area. This is one of those bigger gaps where you don't just use a sealant, you don't just try to do it with hardware cloth. You really need to seal that whole area up. And that's why we think the Critter Cap is one of the best solutions, but there's probably other product providers on the market. Just make sure you use a good product, something that's going to look good, and something that's ultimately going to last and keep that area sealed up. Special situations. Nets can also be installed vertically to prevent birds from accessing walls and ledges. Several ledge products such as spikes, coils, wires, electrical shock tape, and slants are available to exclude birds from ledges. Grid wire systems on flat roofs may prevent birds from nesting and roosting. Whoever came up with the term bird brain must have not been in bird control. The reality is birds are really smart, but one thing we found is things like these nets, spikes, coils, wires, even the electrical shock tape does work pretty well. So just keep in mind when you're dealing with birds, you're dealing with a very smart animal that has very keen eyesight. As you can see how they swoop in for food and find their landing areas, birds are really smart. So we got to make sure we use the right exclusion tools when we're dealing with birds, because it's a whole different ball game than other types of wildlife. This is an alley before bird exclusion work started. As you can see with the droppings all over the AC unit, this was a pretty major roosting area. These are before and after shots of the bird work. As you can see, this was after the decontamination, the cleanup, and the netting was put up. Now, as it goes aesthetically, I think netting looks okay. Is anything perfect? No, but look at it like this. If you do the netting correctly, you make sure it's solid, you make sure it's pulled tight, it's going to look about as good as anything can. At the end of the day, if you don't get rid of the birds, it's not really going to matter. So we always talk about we have to be effective, but we also have to watch the aesthetics. I think this job came out pretty well. What do you think? In this scenario, we're looking at a building where pigeons were perched on the roof. Now, as you guys probably already know if you've been in exclusion work or bird work, pigeon droppings are very corrosive. They can do a lot of damage to a building. So as you can see here at the bottom on the right, we put up the netting, we did the exclusion work. Just like that, the pigeons are kept out. See, these birds and pigeons, they don't really like to land on the netting because their feet get tangled up. So keep in mind, this netting looks pretty decent overall, but it's definitely effective and probably the best solution in this case. Here's a great debate. Do fake owls work or not work when it comes to trying to deter birds? As you can see here, the pigeon seems to be pretty happy on top of the owl. In my opinion, they're not all that effective. As you can see here on the right, these are openings in a church steeple that were closed off with netting. So once again, do deterrents like owls and shiny objects and things like that work? It depends on who you ask, and it depends on the situation. I've not had really good luck with them, but once again, as seen on the right, the netting is usually a big winner. So as you can imagine, eaves, gables, and other protected areas are prime real estate for pigeons. They're basically going to go and nest anywhere they can where they can feel a little bit protected. As you're going to see in the next few slides, we're even going to see areas like ledges where they love to perch. Now, as you can imagine, areas like ledges can be a major problem for birds nesting and roosting. In this case, we used a product called Hot Foot. So it's kind of like a caulk type of product, but you actually put it down. It's got like hot peppers in it, and when the birds try to land on it, nest, or roost, it makes their feet hot and they go away. So this is just another example of a type of product we could use when it comes to bird control. At the end of the day, you may need multiple techniques, and keep in mind, everybody may not want a net over all their home. Like you can see here, they didn't want netting over this window, so we had to go to a different type of technique to make the customer happy. The current building you're looking at was student housing. We were actually working on 60 balconies for this exclusion job. The company that had come out before us thought it was a great idea to use poison corn on pigeons. As you can imagine, when they started dropping dead, students were in a huge uproar and created a major media circus. We were glad that company wasn't us. So as you can see on the right, we were able to put the netting up, solve the problem, without all that hoopla and drama. You never want to be in a situation where pigeons or birds are falling dead all around you, especially when it comes to places like campuses or parks, because people are going to lose their mind. You'll find out real quickly how much people are animal lovers when you do something like that. So once again, just be very careful on the techniques you use. Always look for something that's going to be non-lethal and non-threatening, and you definitely don't want to make the news for the wrong reasons. The current building you're looking at was student housing. We were actually working on 60 balconies for this exclusion job. The company that had come out before us thought it was a great idea to use poison corn on pigeons. As you can imagine, when they started dropping dead, students were in a huge uproar and created a major media circus. We were glad that company wasn't us. So as you can see on the right, we were able to put the netting up, solve the problem, without all that hoopla and drama. You never want to be in a situation where pigeons or birds are falling dead all around you, especially when it comes to places like campuses or parks, because people are going to lose their mind. You'll find out real quickly how much people are animal lovers when you do something like that. So once again, just be very careful on the techniques you use. Always look for something that's going to be non-lethal and non-threatening, and you definitely don't want to make the news for the wrong reasons. On occasion, trapping is going to be the best solution. When there is a large population of pigeons that have established roosting and nesting on a building, the population must be reduced and the contaminated surfaces must be cleaned. Once the population has been reduced and surfaces cleaned, exclusion methods can be implemented. On this particular job, over 700 pigeons were trapped in 10 days. Always refer to your local ordinances for trapping requirements, including permits. So basically what we had here is this was a Save-On drugstore. There were pigeons all over the sign. So as you can imagine, when you're dealing with something like a drugstore, you have to think, if I've got a big sign out front everybody's going to be looking at, I can't put netting over that sign. I mean, in theory you could, because the netting could be, loosely strewn enough, but the problem is that most businesses are not going to be okay with that and the look it gives them. So in reality, we had to do something a little bit different. We had to go with trapping. We had to set up all these traps. We had to make sure we checked them daily and started taking these pigeons out. Eventually, over 700 were caught, and this method worked. But keep in mind, we really had to think about what method was going to be the best. So there's not a one-size-fits-all. There's not a solution that works for everything. So you have to be smart enough to look at all the different techniques and apply them as they should be to each situation based on what you have there. Let's talk about other exclusion methods. Protecting individual trees and plants. Use wire or plastic tree guards to protect trees from trunk girdling by wildlife. More expensive wire guards provide longer-term damage prevention. When using tubes to protect plants, place screen over the top to prevent entrapment of cavity nesting birds. Use nets to protect trees and other plants from bird depredation. Ensure that the nets reach the ground, as birds may try to fly or walk underneath. So basically, as you can see in the image here, we need to make sure that the nets encompass the whole tree and that they do reach the ground, because birds will try to work their way in. Now, we talked earlier about how birds have keen eyesight, so they're going to figure out a way in if you leave it open. So just make sure that tree is fully encompassed, including the base of the ground underneath. Protect young trees from beaver damage by installing a 1 to 2 inch wire mesh fence around the tree. Wire or plastic mesh will protect plants from deer. Plastic mesh fence protects a shrub from deer. Anchor the fence securely to post, as animals will bend it to reach branches or the trunk. The fence should be 4 inches or more away from the trunk for beavers and 4 inches or more away from the branches for deer. Extend the fence 4 feet high or higher for beavers and 6 to 8 feet for deer. For javelina, to protect new plantings, set the fence at a minimum of 3 feet high and extend the fence 10 to 12 inches from the branches. For beavers, bury the lower edge of the fence 6 inches into the soil to prevent them from digging under it. Let's talk about different species, fence types to exclude them, and minimum fence dimensions. When we're looking at deer with non-electric fences, they're going to need to be about 8 feet high. With electric fences for deer, we're going to need 2 strands, one 1 foot from the ground, and a second one 4 feet from the ground. When fencing raccoons, we would use 1 inch mesh buried 2 inches and extending underground 1 foot or more. Fence should extend 4 feet above ground with an electrified wire 6 to 8 inches below the top, or strands of electric wire 5 and 10 inches off the ground. When fencing woodchucks with non-electric fences, we would use a 1 inch mesh buried 2 inch and extending underground 1 foot or more. Fence should extend 4 feet above ground and have 1 foot overhang to prevent climbing. When installing an electric fence for woodchucks, we're going to use a 1 inch mesh buried 2 inches and extending underground 1 foot or more. Fence should extend 4 feet above ground with an electrified wire 6 to 8 inches in below the top, or a strand of electric wire 4 to 5 inches off the ground. Unfortunately, fences can be expensive if large areas need protection. While requiring lower maintenance than electric fences, non-electric fences typically cost much more to install due to the high cost of woven wire, post, anchors, braces, fasteners, and labor. Electric fences act as behavioral deterrents. They use a painful but harmless shock to interfere with wildlife movements. They often have lower initial construction costs, but require higher continued maintenance. Electric fences fail to prevent wildlife damage when unsuitable designs are used. They are not installed according to manufacturer specifications, or maintenance is inadequate. Frequent monitoring and vegetation control are required to maintain sufficient shocking power, at least 3,000 volts, on the fence. Electricity can be used exclusively with a fence, as with the polytape fence, or in conjunction with a non-electric fence. Electric fence technology has improved dramatically over the years. Fences can be powered using electrical outlets, disposable batteries, or rechargeable batteries connected to a solar electric panel. Modern low-impedance chargers deliver pulses of electricity that produce a painful but not continuous jolt of electricity. The gap in the pulse allows people and animals to move away from the fence. While the shock generally is considered safe for adults and older children, always consider the presence of young children in the area. Electric fences can be used to protect home gardens from deer and woodchuck damage during the growing season. By the way, going back to attic exclusion, If you are new to walking on or crawling around in attics with unfinished floors, take my advice. Either learn how to do sheetrock, wallboard repair, or hook up with someone that does and keep them in your favorites folder. At some point you'll need them, I guarantee it. We've all been there. Also, some more free advice, keep a roll of 4mm plastic and some duct tape on your truck to temporarily fix the hole in the ceiling. In conclusion, animal exclusion of any type takes an understanding of the pest, with an understanding and working knowledge of the necessary and proper materials to use. The use of trade names in this publication is solely for the purpose of providing specific information or as examples. American Pest CEUs does not guarantee or warranty the products named, and the references to them in this publication do not signify our approval to the exclusion of other products of suitable composition. All chemicals should be used in accordance with the directions on the manufacturer's label. Use pesticides safely. Read and follow directions on the manufacturer's label. Thank you for choosing us. We would appreciate any comments you may have about the course. Please send us an email to pestceus@gmail.com. You are now ready to proceed to the exam. Once completed, you will receive your certificate.